Israel versus Iran. The night everything went out of control. The night everything went out of control did not begin with a declaration. It began with a missile, and then another, and then 100 more, and then the financial markets opened in Asia, and the number that appeared on trading screens across Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Dubai was not a military casualty count. It was an oil price, and that oil price told every institutional investor, every sovereign wealth fund manager, every central bank governor, simultaneously, what the diplomatic language and the military press releases were carefully constructed to obscure, that the conflict between Israel and Iran had crossed the threshold that separates manageable regional military confrontation from unmanageable global financial catastrophe, that the line between a war in the Middle East and a crisis in your pension fund, your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, and the sovereign debt sustainability of every government on earth had just been erased, in a single night, without a single vote, without a single warning that the mainstream financial press had bothered to transmit before the markets opened, and the damage was already done. Here is the number that defines this night. The Strait of Hormuz handles 21 million barrels of oil per day. Every percentage point of that flow that becomes uncertain, not disrupted, not blocked, merely uncertain, adds approximately $3 to $5 to the global oil price within 72 hours. When Israel struck Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure, and Iran responded with the largest ballistic missile barrage in its history against Israeli territory and American regional bases, simultaneously, the uncertainty about Hormuz flow did not increase by a percentage point. It increased by an order of magnitude, and the oil price did not add $3 to $5. It moved in the specific violent momentum-driven way that physical oil markets move when the traders who actually move barrels, not the speculators, the actual physical commodity traders whose job is ensuring that refineries have feedstock next week, conclude simultaneously that their supply chain assumptions for the next 30 to 90 days have just become fictional. This is the night that every financial model built on Persian Gulf stability became a historical document, and the reconstruction of those models, the repricing of every asset class that is directly or indirectly connected to the energy supply architecture of the global economy, has not yet begun in earnest. The markets are still pricing the shock, they have not yet begun pricing the duration. And the duration is where the real financial catastrophe lives. Let's establish the operational picture of what happened with the precision that its financial consequences demand. Because the specific military events of this night are not primarily a military story. They are the trigger mechanism of a financial detonation that was loaded and cocked by 50 years of petrodollar architecture, $313 trillion in global debt, and a derivatives market that bet its entire existence on the proposition that Persian Gulf supply disruption would remain a tail risk rather than a base case. Israel's strike package targeted 3 categories of Iranian infrastructure simultaneously. Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, representing the culmination of a decades-long Israeli strategic objective to eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons pathway before it reached the point of no return. Iranian air defense systems, the S-300 batteries, the Bavar 373 installations, the radar networks covering western Iran, systematically degraded to enable sustained strike operations without prohibitive Israeli aircraft loss rates, and Iranian ballistic missile production facilities, the underground complexes in the Zagros Mountains, where Iran manufactures the Shahab, the Zulfiqar, the Fatah series, targeted specifically to reduce Iran's capacity for sustained retaliatory strikes over the weeks following the initial attack. The strike package required approximately 100 Israeli F-35I Adir aircraft, the most advanced combat aircraft in Israel's inventory, with a combat radius of 400 kilometers that reaches Iranian territory from Israeli soil, only with aerial refueling support. American KC-46 and KC-135 tanker aircraft provided that refueling from bases in the region, making American fingerprints on the operation not deniable but deliberate. The deliberateness matters financially because it eliminated the ambiguity that would have allowed Iran to calibrate its retaliation below the threshold of American involvement. Iran's retaliation was therefore calibrated to American involvement, not to Israeli capability, to American involvement. And American involvement changes the financial stakes of the retaliation from a bilateral Israel-Iran conflict to a direct Iran-America confrontation with all the Persian Gulf infrastructure, consequences that direct confrontation implies. Iran's retaliatory response was massive in scale and strategically precise in target selection, in ways that the military coverage has almost completely missed. Iran did not simply fire missiles at Israeli cities. Iran fired at Israeli cities approximately 200 ballistic missiles targeting Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Israeli military installations, while simultaneously launching separate strike packages at American regional assets, including Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, U.S. Naval Forces Central Command installations in Bahrain, and the Carrier Strike Group operating in the northern Arabian Sea. 3 simultaneous target sets: Israeli civilian and military infrastructure, American military infrastructure, and the target set that nobody in the mainstream press has adequately covered: Gulf energy infrastructure. A separate Iranian strike element targeted oil processing facilities in the Gulf, not Aramco's Abqaiq directly, which would have been the most dramatic escalation, but the network of smaller processing and pumping stations along the Gulf Coast that collectively handle the logistical movement of Saudi, Kuwaiti, and Emirati crude from wellhead to export terminal. These are not the headline facilities that generate satellite imagery and press conferences. They are the unglamorous logistical infrastructure, whose disruption does not stop oil production but delays oil export by days to weeks, creating the supply uncertainty that physical oil traders price as immediate barrel scarcity regardless of whether actual production has been affected. Iran targeted the uncertainty generator, not the production destroyer. The financial sophistication of that targeting choice is extraordinary and completely unreported. Now apply the financial mathematics to what this targeting strategy produces. Abqaiq processes 7% of global daily oil supply. The export logistics network that Iran targeted handles the movement of approximately 6 to 8 million barrels per day of Gulf crude toward tanker terminals. Disruption of that logistics network for 2 weeks, not destruction, disruption, removes 6 to 8 million barrels per day from predictable export schedules. Against global spare capacity of approximately 2 to 3 million barrels per day, the supply deficit is not 6 to 8 million barrels. The supply deficit is 6 to 8 million barrels minus 2 to 3 million barrels of spare capacity, 3 to 5 million barrels per day of uncoverable supply shortfall sustained for 2 weeks. At current consumption levels, global strategic petroleum reserves cover approximately 1.7 billion barrels, roughly 17 days of total global consumption at 100 million barrels per day. Against a 3 to 5 million barrel per day shortfall for 2 weeks, the SPR math works. Barely. But the SPR math assumes coordinated release from all IEA members simultaneously. It assumes American SPR at full capacity, which it is not, sitting at 1983 lows after the Biden administration's drawdowns. And it assumes no Hormuz interdiction on top of the logistics disruption. None of these assumptions held on the night everything went out of control. The financial history of Middle East military escalation that crosses the threshold from bilateral conflict to energy supply disruption follows a pattern so consistent across 6 decades that it constitutes something approaching a financial law. Every time conflict in the Persian Gulf region has produced genuine uncertainty about energy supply at the scale that this night has produced, the financial consequences have exceeded every official forecast made at the moment of escalation onset. Without exception. In both directions, the oil price impact is always larger than projected. The duration of elevated prices is always longer than projected. And the secondary financial consequences, transmitted through inflation, interest rates, sovereign debt, and equity markets are always more severe and more prolonged than the official crisis management framework anticipated. Study October 1973. The Arab oil embargo following the Yom Kippur War reduced oil supply to Western nations by approximately 5 million barrels per day, a reduction remarkably similar in scale to the supply uncertainty this night has created. The official American government forecast at the embargo's onset projected a manageable price increase of $2 to $3 per barrel over a 3-month period, followed by normalization as diplomatic resolution was achieved. The actual outcome was a quadrupling of oil prices from $3 to $12 per barrel, sustained for more than a year, generating an inflationary shock that the Nixon administration's price controls could not contain, that the Federal Reserve's subsequent monetary tightening converted into a severe recession, and whose financial consequences reshaped the global economic landscape for the remainder of the decade. The official projection was wrong by a factor of 4 on price and wrong by a factor of 3 on duration. The hidden financial force that made the 1973 forecasts wrong, and that makes every official forecast made during Persian Gulf energy crisis systematically wrong in the same direction, is the difference between physical market dynamics and financial model assumptions. Financial models assume that oil markets respond to supply-demand fundamentals with the rational efficiency of a textbook commodity market. Physical oil markets respond to fear, to the specific visceral, operationally urgent fear of refinery operators who cannot explain to their boards why the plant will be idle next month because the tanker that was supposed to deliver their feedstock has not cleared Hormuz, and the next available alternative supply is priced $30 above their cost structure assumptions. That fear is not rational in the financial model sense. It is rational in the operational sense. And operational rationality in physical commodity markets produces price movements that financial models consistently underestimate because financial models were not built by people who have ever had to explain to a board why the plant is idle. The 1973 parallel is the closest historical match to the current night. But the financial stakes of the current version are categorically larger for 3 specific reasons that the 1973 experience did not involve. First, global debt in 1973 was a fraction of the $313 trillion that exists today, meaning the inflationary shock from oil price escalation transmits into a debt service burden that 1973 governments simply did not carry. Second, the derivatives market that sits on top of oil price stability assumptions did not exist in 1973. The $30 trillion in notional oil derivatives exposure that faces margin call pressure when Brent moves violently, did not exist, meaning the financial system amplification of the oil price shock is orders of magnitude larger than 1973. And third, the Federal Reserve in 1973 had policy rate room to respond, rates were positive in real terms, and the Fed had conventional monetary policy tools available. Today's Fed is fighting this oil shock with a balance sheet already at $7.7 trillion and a $34 trillion national debt, whose interest costs consume $1 trillion annually, at current rates. The 1973 policy toolkit was robust. The 2025 policy toolkit is exhausted before the crisis has fully developed. The deeper historical pattern that this night fits, more precisely than 1973 and more ominously, is the chain of events between July and November 1914. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was not a global financial crisis trigger in the conventional sense. It was a regional political event that activated the alliance and treaty structures that European powers had constructed over the preceding decades, structures that converted a bilateral conflict into a continental war, through the mechanical operation of commitments made in a different strategic environment than the one in which they were being activated. The financial markets of 1914 did not anticipate the scale of what was coming. The London Stock Exchange closed for the first time in its history on July 31, 1914, not because anyone knew what was coming, but because the uncertainty had become too large for normal market function to accommodate. The Israel-Iran conflict is activating the alliance and financial architecture structures that have been constructed over the preceding decades. The American security commitments to Israel, the Iranian alliance with Russia and China, the petrodollar architecture connecting Gulf stability to global financial system function, the derivatives market that converts oil price volatility into systemic financial stress in ways that no individual actor fully controlled or anticipated. Like 1914, the night everything went out of control did not happen because anyone chose for everything to go out of control. It happened because the structures built in calmer times activated under pressure in ways that their architects did not fully model, and that their inheritors cannot easily reverse. Watch 5 developments in the next 7 days that will determine whether this night is the beginning of a sustained financial restructuring or a severe but contained shock that the global system absorbs at enormous cost. First, watch the Strait of Hormuz tanker movement data published daily by ship tracking services. Any reduction in tanker transits below the normal 20 to 25 vessels per day is not a military statistic. It is a physical oil supply statistic that will translate directly into oil price within 48 to 72 hours. A 20% reduction in Hormuz tanker traffic sustained for 1 week produces a physical supply deficit that IEA strategic reserve releases cannot fully compensate. Second, watch the Israeli shekel and the Iranian rial simultaneously. The shekel is the most sensitive real-time indicator of Israeli institutional assessment of the conflict's duration and severity. Israeli institutional investors with direct access to military intelligence pricing their currency based on what they know rather than what is publicly stated. Shekel weakness beyond 5% against the dollar signals that Israeli institutions are pricing a conflict duration measured in months rather than weeks. The rial's black market rate, the rate at which ordinary Iranians are converting rials to dollars outside official channels, is the most honest indicator of Iranian domestic financial confidence available. Black market rial depreciation above 30% signals that Iranian domestic confidence in the regime's ability to manage the economic consequences of the conflict has broken. Third, watch the emergency G7 finance minister consultation schedule. A convened emergency G7 finance minister call within 72 hours of this night signals that the financial consequences have already exceeded the normal crisis management capacity of individual national authorities and require coordinated international response. The 2008 crisis generated G7 coordination within days of Lehman. The speed of the coordination signal is the most accurate available indicator of how seriously the people responsible for managing the financial consequences privately assess the severity of what they are publicly describing in managed language. Fourth, watch gold's intraday behavior specifically. Not the daily close, the intraday movement pattern. When gold rises sharply in Asian trading hours before European and American institutional investors are active, it signals that the sovereign wealth funds and central banks of the Gulf, of Asia, and of the BRICS economies are buying hard assets in the specific window when Western institutional selling pressure is absent. Asian hours gold strength is the financial system's most geographically honest signal. It represents the assessment of the institutions closest to the geographic epicenter of the crisis rather than the assessment of the institutions most invested in projecting stability. Fifth, and most critically, watch whether Saudi Arabia makes any public statement about oil production policy within 72 hours of this night. Saudi Arabia has 2 available responses to Persian Gulf military escalation that directly affects its energy infrastructure. It can increase production to offset supply disruption, the cooperative response that maintains the American security relationship, and the petrodollar architecture. Or it can reduce production, citing security concerns, infrastructure protection needs, or force majeure, the response that maximizes Saudi financial leverage in a supply-constrained environment and signals that the security relationship with America is no longer sufficient to guarantee Saudi cooperative behavior in energy markets. Saudi production policy in the 72 hours following this night is the single most consequential financial signal available. It determines whether the oil price shock is manageable or cascading, and it tells you more about the future of the petrodollar than any analyst note or government statement produced in the same period. Here is the final truth that the night everything went out of control demands be stated without the diplomatic hedging that makes truths of this magnitude politically manageable, but analytically useless. The Israel-Iran conflict is not a Middle East regional war with global financial implications. It is a global financial crisis with a Middle East military expression. The military events are real, and their human consequences are devastating, and they deserve the attention and the moral seriousness that human suffering always demands. But the financial architecture that makes this conflict globally catastrophic rather than regionally tragic was not built by the combatants. It was built by the petrodollar system, by the $313 trillion global debt load, by the $30 trillion derivatives market, by the exhausted central banks, by the 50 years of financial globalization that connected the security of every pension fund, every mortgage, every government bond in every country on earth, to the stability of a 21-mile-wide waterway in the Persian Gulf. The night everything went out of control was the night the financial architecture that was supposed to make global war too expensive to fight discovered that it had instead made global financial catastrophe the automatic consequence of regional military escalation. The architecture did not prevent the conflict, it globalized its consequences, and the people who built that architecture, the central bankers, the petrodollar architects, the derivatives market engineers, built it with the sincere belief that financial interdependence was a substitute for political stability. This night is the answer to that belief. And the answer is the most expensive lesson in the history of financial engineering. The question that history will ask about this night is not who fired first, it is who built the system that made the first shot heard around the financial world. And the answer to that question is the answer that changes everything about how the world that comes after this night gets built.